Hi. This is a narration of the portion of the China Multi-Generational Panel Datasets Training Guide that discusses the strengths and weaknesses of the China Multi-Generational Panel Dataset CMGPD-LN. The basic idea is to outline, on the one hand, some of the distinguishing features of the Liaoning dataset that make it sort of special as a source for studying historical demography, but then also flag for the attention of users some of the characteristics that need to be dealt with or addressed or may limit the potential applications. So the China Multi-Generational Panel Database, Liaoning, has a number of strengths that make it notable as a source for studying quantitative social history or historical demography. I've touched on some of these in the narration of the other module about the CMGPD household registers as sources compared to other sources. So here I'll be a little more specific and focus on details. So first of all, the CMGPD-LN has household and village of residence. Again, as was mentioned in the sort of comparison of the household registers with other sources, this level of detail basically regularly updated information on who people live with, and then the village in which they live is fairly rare in traditional sources for the study of historical demography like genealogies and parish registers. Genealogies may specify the town in which a branch of a lineage resided. Sometimes they may have the place in which a person was born or where they died, but it's extremely rare for them to record on a continuous basis their locations. Similarly, parish registers typically only record information about where people were at the time they experienced an event that was recorded in the register, that is a baptism, a marriage, or a burial. The CMGPD-LN, like the other CMGPD databases, is longitudinal. So you have, again, the ability to follow people over time from one register to the next. In sort of best case scenario, you have people basically recorded from the time they were born until the time they died, and then you have families recorded over multiple generations with the possibility of linking people within their families. Again, that sort of longitudinal detail is, at least until recently, has been very rare in censuses. Traditionally, it was very hard to link people across time in censuses, especially in highly mobile populations like in the United States, where people moved around a lot. Maybe they were only observed every 10 years. A lot of people had the same names. And so it's only recently that we've actually begun to see some longitudinally linked censuses, or samples from censuses, both from the United States, from the IPUMS project, and then North Atlantic Population Project. And then to reiterate, again, from the comparison between household registers and other sources, you have complete recording of the at-risk population. So at any point in time, you actually do know who is at risk of experiencing an event in the case of the Liaoning data in the next 3 years. So you don't have the same right censoring issues that you often have with some other types of sources. And the worst case scenarios with parish registers, it can be very difficult to know who is at risk of experiencing an event. Another distinguishing feature of the CMGPD Liaoning is the time span, the sheer size, and the geographic coverage. So the CMGPD-LN covers a fairly large area of Liaoning for more than 150 years. So you basically have 1.5 million observations of 250,000 people scattered over an area the size roughly of New Jersey or the Netherlands. And I'll talk a bit more about that in just a second. The CMGPD-LN is multi-generational, so we can follow families for as many as 6 or 7 generations. That's hard to do in a lot of other household registers because, especially in Europe, the people were fairly mobile, and so they might grow up in one area, might marry in one area, but then move somewhere else, and then they would exit from whatever household register was entered and then reappear elsewhere. Related to the fact that the CMGPD-LN is multi-generational, there's a lot of detail on patrilineal kinship, and this, in fact, because it's prospective, you can follow these kin groups forward, and so you can not only see the kin groups that survive and flourish, but also the ones that are sort of stagnant or actually decline. So in the following slides, I'm going to expand on each of these points. One of the remarkable features of the China multi-generational panel dataset Liaoning is the geographic coverage combined with the geographic specificity. So the communities that are covered in the household registers that make up the CMGPD, or that were the basis of the CMGPD, are scattered across a fairly large swath of Liaoning, from the sort of coastal area near Gaizhou, what is now, or the city Yingkou, down in the south, or on the peninsula, to the very hilly, somewhat remote areas of heavily forested areas up in Kaiyuan and Tieling. So the communities across these areas actually represent a fairly wide variety of ecological contexts. So the communities down south near Gaizhou, they were coastal. Some of them were engaged in fishing. Some of them were engaged in sort of raising orchards and so forth, that sort of agricultural production. Niuzhuang and Haicheng were agricultural. There was a little bit of mining. There was also a lot of commercial activity in that region. That's sort of going back quite some time. That's been a sort of commercial center. Liaoyang and Shenyang is more, at least in the outskirts of those cities, a more sort of typical dry field agriculture. And then you do have people in one of the data sets, the Changmei data set, people who were explicitly recorded as having lived in Shenyang. And then sort of going north up through Faku and parts of Tieling, you again have sort of typical northeast Chinese dry field agriculture. But then going out to the east into sort of these parts of Kaiyuan and Tieling, you have a lot of sort of very hilly areas where people, they might have engaged in some farming, but they were also engaged in husbandry, forestry, and a lot of other things. So we like to argue that there is, even though this data are not statistically representative of Liaoning in a formal sense, there's a sort of variety of contexts here that account for a sort of fair diversity. And I think there's an argument to be made that if you see similar phenomenon apparent across all of these different economic contexts, some of which are sort of similar to contexts, obviously, you might have seen elsewhere in China, that you may be seeing something that's, say, more broadly representative, not just of Liaoning, but of, other parts of China. Now, it's not only that the data are sort of geographically broad, but we do have the locations of the communities in which a very large percentage of the people that we actually see recorded in the registers actually lived. So we have something like the dots on this map correspond to villages that appear in the registers that we physically identified or actually located geographic coordinates for. And those villages are something like 120, 100, depending on how you count, 150 or so villages, and they account for 95% of the population in the registers. So we do have sort of specific geographic coordinates for village of residence for something like 95% of the population. One sort of caveat there is that we're missing the locations or village names in some of the very early registers. It was really only in 1789 that the registers really became consistent about specifying the villages in which people lived. So that's one caveat. Another issue related to the geographic coverage is that each register series, each of the 29 register series, was a sort of administrative population that was generally concentrated in a specific area, but in fact sometimes overlapped with other administrative populations recorded in other registers, or overlapped with populations that were not recorded in any register at all. So while the registers record 100% of the sort of administrative population that they are supposed to focus on, there were clearly other people living in the same areas, sometimes in the same villages, that were not recorded in either in any register at all, because they were just simply not under the same administrative system as was covered by the registration system, or they were in other registers that are either haven't been coded yet. There's still a lot of registers sitting in the archives that have yet to be coded. In some cases, they are just in registers, other registers that we have coded, so you can see the same village appearing in different registers, which should offer some opportunities to examine sort of institutional context and its role in shaping outcomes, because if you have different people living in the same village but associated with different administrative populations and different register sets, should be opportunities to distinguish and the effects of that institutional affiliation. But again, the point is that even though, again, we have close to 100% of the targeted hereditary administrative populations that were covered by these specific registers, there are people living in the same areas, sometimes in the same villages, that are covered in other registers or not in any register at all. So we're not getting a complete picture of the entire population of this swath within Liaoning. Another distinguishing feature of the China Multi-Generational Panel Database Liaoning is the sheer size of the database and the number of observations available for every year. So in the earliest available years, there's typically somewhere between a few thousand and 10,000 observations, basically up to 1989. That reflects that sort of relatively smaller number of observations reflects not only smaller population, but also the fact that there were a lot more missing registers in those early years, so there were more gaps between the time gaps between the registers that we do have coded. So if you look at a tabulation of the years for available registers, the coverage is much spottier up until roughly 1789. 1789, there was a overhaul of the registration system that both increased the detail of the registers and then also seems to have produced something that was much more consistent in terms of the survival of the resulting registers. And then, so as of the 1790s, we're getting typically in any given year something like 20,000 observations. A lot of the ups and downs from one year to another are attributable not to actual real changes in the population, but just that in, say, specific years there are, say, an unusually large number of registers missing, or a unusually large number of surviving registers. Especially noticeable is 1807, where we have a relatively small number of surviving registers. Remember, there were 29 distinct administrative populations, each with their own set of registers, and any given set of registers has, again, different years that are missing, whether the original registers were destroyed in the archives or mishandled, whatever, we don't know. It's not every register series has the same years missing, but the exception is 1807 and 1810. We have an unusually large number of the 29 administrative populations. An unusually large number of the registers are missing from those years. But generally, the trend suggested by the overall trend of increased population between the 1780s and 1820s is probably a real trend. If you look at individual registers and look at the sort of change in the number of people in a specific administrative population over time, it's pretty consistent that there was growth between the 1780s and then the 1820s. And then some sort of stabilization in the size of the population from the 1820s up to the 1860s and 70s. We talked about this a bit in our book, Fate and Fortune, published in 1997, that there's some reason to think that maybe around the 1820s or 1830s was maybe the time roughly when the region really began to fill up, and it was much harder to find new vacant land and so forth, and that may have been associated with a sort of stabilization in the population. And then again, we have roughly 27,000 observations per year up to the 1880s, in fact up to 1888. Then what we have actually between 1888 and 1903, one thing to be noted is that there is a gap in all of the administrative populations. So of the 29 register series, we've never located any registers from the period between 1888 and 1901. That is, we don't have registers for the years 1891, 1894, 1897, or I guess it would be 1900. We don't know what happened. We have some speculation. Maybe the registers from those years were all stored in one specific location in the archive and were all destroyed. We just don't know. And then in 1901, we begin to see registers again, and a lot more people. It's important to note, there are changes over time, and we come back to this later, in the sort of the quality of the recording, the types of things that were recorded. So it's important that when you do your analysis, you do a lot of descriptive work looking at the specific variables that you're interested in, and their time trends to sort of isolate whether there are specific time periods that you need to pay special attention to, because maybe the data might be problematic in those time periods and so forth. So the most important of these discontinuities in 1789, again, there was a big change in the registration system leading up to 1789. Registers before 1789 typically don't record people in their household of residence, just record their lineage or household group, and they tend not to record as much in the way of information about village of residence, etc. There's many other time patterns as well, and we get to sort of into more detail with some of those later in. But again, it's important that when you do your analysis to look for changes over time in the kind of distributions and the characteristics of the variables that you're interested in. The broader important point is that with this many observations, including lots of observations in any given year, you have a lot of opportunity to run sort of either fairly complex models with lots of say interactions, because you have a lot of degrees of freedom to use up, and you can also with a data set this large, quite often you can sort of isolate, say, cases with very specific characteristics that you might be interested in to do, apply matching or other techniques that are very intensive. That with a data set this large, even if you apply some very stringent criteria to look for people with very specific kinds of characteristics in order to do matching or something like that, out of 1.5 million observations, you may very easily find out that there's several hundred or several thousand observations sufficient for, say, the application of certain very specialized techniques or the investigation of kind of very specific kinds of contexts. Another remarkable feature of the China Multi-Generational Panel Database, the Liaoning, is the possibility for multi-generational linkage, because we know in any given register how people were related to each other in the household. It's very easy to link people at least to their patrilineal kin. And so this figure summarizes our success at intergenerational or multi-generational linkage. So for nearly everybody in the born into the population, we can link nearly about 100% of them to their fathers. So we have basically a complete linkage to fathers. And then even in the very earliest registers, we can identify grandfathers for something like 60% of the newborn children. And then as time goes on and we have more generational depth in later registers, that gets up to close to 100%. If we're looking at great-grandfathers, by 1800, we can link sort of 40% of newborns to a great-grandfather. And then again, by the late 19th century, that gets up to close to 100%. What's remarkable is that if you take something like great-great-great-great-grandfather, by the late 19th century, something like 60% of people can be associated with a named great-great-great-great-grandfather in the registers, probably somebody who lived in the late 18th century. And again, this is patrilineal linkage because of the data make it very easy to associate people with their mothers and fathers. And then the problem is that we can't do much with matrilineal linkage because essentially when women marry in, we don't know what family they came from. Women come into the registers and appear as somebody's wife, and we just have their surname and a year of birth, that is their maiden surname and their year of birth, but it's so far been difficult to associate them with a specific family elsewhere in the area. Meanwhile, these data do have records of daughters, but again, when daughters marry out, we simply have an annotation that they married out. They left the family, but we don't know where they went. So we have not been able to do matrilineal linking, but the patrilineal linking has been very successful, and given the importance of patrilineal relationship networks in historical Chinese society, that's still important. One of the things that this multi-generational linkage allows us to do is essentially reconstruct patrilineal descent lines or lineages through record linkage, and then create variables that associate individuals with their patrilineal descent lines, and then treat the patrilineal descent line as another unit of analysis along with, say, village or region, etc. So we can look at differences between descent lines in terms of social and demographic outcomes and so forth, or we can compute aggregate characteristics of descent lines just like we can compute, say, aggregate characteristics of villages and so forth. The public release of the CMGPD-LN includes a number of sort of grouping variables that can be used to sort of divide people up into descent lines variously defined. These variables reflect sort of different breadth in terms of the definition of the descent line. So the narrowest is most narrowly defined sort of grouping variable for associating people with other members of their descent line. Patrilineal descent line is founder ID. Basically, everybody in the registers who has a common male ancestor who is actually specifically identified or appears in the registers, if they have that ancestor in common, founder ID will be the person ID of that common ancestor. So basically this allows you to, say, group together all of the descendants of somebody who appeared in the, or who was alive in the earliest available register in a series. So these obviously tend to be small because they're sort of based on, say, one person in the earliest available register, and then their descendants. Typically, there's in one of these groups, there's about 10 or so individuals with about 59 observations. We have a slightly differently defined but related grouping variable where we group people together according to common descent from a inferred specific ancestor who may have predated the registers, so that, say, if we had a bunch of siblings living together in an earliest available register, we know that these brothers must have had a father in common So we infer or impute a ID to their common male ancestor who we don't actually observe in the registers, and then propagate that inferred identifier to all of their descendants. This looks a little unusual in that this should be, generate sort of larger kin groups than founder ID, but this also reflects it's heavily influenced by the sort of properties of the earliest available registers. So you end up actually with more units. Unique Ihu, that groups together all of the people descended from the members of a single Ihu in an earliest available register. An Ihu was an administrative unit composed of households. Sort of a residential household in the registers was referred to as a ringhu, and then they were grouped together in the registers as Ihu, which meant it was an administrative unit referring to household group. Generally, these household groups, the people that were made up a household group were all members patrilineally related. They always had the same surnames. Generally, if you look at them, they have the generation characters in common. So you can be pretty sure that in an earliest available register, people are grouped together in a single Ihu. They have some point in the past, they have a common patrilineal ancestor. And so when we trace through the registers, and for every sort of Ihu in an earliest available register, we assign a common ID to everybody who's descended from anyone in that Ihu. So you get, again, that gives us, for the 250,000 or so people in the registers, it groups them into 2,688 distinct sort of descent lines, where we can infer that they're all descended from a common male ancestor who probably lived sometime before the registration system got started. Finally, we have a unique group, which is our sort of broadest definition of the kinship group, where we assume that sort of people in adjacent Ihu in an earliest available register who share the same surname are related to each other. So if you look at the earliest available registers, what you'll typically see is that, in fact, if there's several Ihu in a row that all have the same surname, it turns out there's strong reason to think they're actually all related. They'll often all have the same generation characters and so forth. So it's reasonable to assume that they're actually, again, a single descent line, again with a common male ancestor who may have arrived in the region, or at least in the village, sometime in the 16th or 17th century, maybe, well, not the 16th, but 17th or 18th century. And that gives us something like 1,000 groups, each with about 250 people. So that's a fairly large analytic unit, and then that's been the basis of some of our analyses where we've tried to compare, say, variation between descent lines and variation between villages in terms of their importance for social and demographic outcomes. And again, you can use this in a random effects analysis, or you can compute aggregate characteristics of groups and so forth. These are, I think, some of the most important variables and unique variables in this data set, because essentially you have so many descent lines that you can, again, subject them to sort of the same sorts of analysis to look at variation across descent lines and so forth that you might use to study variation across villages. Again, random fixed effects models and so forth. And one of the real remarkable things is that we also, because the data are prospective, you follow these descent lines forward. So you get the descent lines that fail along with the ones who succeed. And this is a big difference from, say, studies of lineages or descent lines based on, say, typical family genealogies, because basically, by definition, typical family genealogies tend to be most likely to be available for successful families, right? If a family or lineage becomes extinct or dies out, there's no one to maintain the genealogy, and there is no genealogy that perhaps for the present day. And so if you're studying descent lines using say, large numbers of surviving genealogies, you're really sort of focused on the winners, and you're missing the sort of losers, the less successful lineages. The China multi-generational panel databases, Liaoning, also have some limitations that we would like to draw your attention to. Probably the most important is that the many boys who died in infancy or early childhood are omitted. So this partly reflects the fact that the registers are triennial, every 3 years, and they seek to record people who were alive and present at the time of the compilation of the register. So by definition, a child who was born in the 3-year period between 2 registers and then dies also within that period is by design unlikely to appear in the register that covers the end of that 3-year period. But it's a little more serious than that, because quite often parents appear not to have registered their children until they were a little older, maybe 4, 5, 6 years old. So it seems that there are probably a fair number of boys who, say, died either in infancy or early childhood, maybe a little later in childhood, who we simply do not have any record of in the registers. So if you want to do infant or early child mortality, you have to recognize or acknowledge that there probably is some selection in terms of what sorts of children were actually recorded in the registers at relatively early ages. As far as we can tell, once children appeared in the registers, and we do see some children, boys, being recorded in the registers at very young ages, 1, 2, 3 sway. Once they're in the registers, the recording of subsequent mortalities seems complete. So, the question is whether those children who are recorded in the registers at a very early age differ in some way that we don't know about from the ones whose parents were going to wait until they were a little older. But we certainly, so you may be able to, with these caveats, use the registers to study, say, early child mortality, 2, 3, 4 years of age. But again, that's subject to caveats, and it's very difficult to do infant mortality. Also, because we don't have exact dates of birth and death, so we just have a year in which somebody was born. One implication of this omission is that if you compute fertility indices based on numbers of male births, they are going to underestimate the level of fertility. So if you're trying to estimate a total marital fertility rate, a total fertility rate, that requires some adjustment based on some assumption about the numbers of boys who were sort of dying before they were old enough to be registered. And we did some of this in Fate and Fortune. If you are doing an event history analysis of fertility, you would probably need to assume that that the chances of essentially not being recorded are in some ways independent of some of your other variables. The more serious omission is actually with daughters. So in the CMGPD-LN, there's very few female births that are registered at all. There are a few daughters, but not many. And the daughters who are registered tend to be in the years before the 1820s. But again, that's if you look at the absolute sex ratios of children in the registers, they're very skewed. They're very too far skewed to be natural. And so there's a lot of daughters that are being born and either then eventually dying or more likely marrying out without ever leaving a record in the register, at least while they were unmarried. Now, it is important to keep in mind that even though daughters tend to be severely underregistered, especially after the 1820s and 30s, these registers do record married and widowed women more completely than in almost any other pre-20th century Chinese source. So once women appear in their husband's household as wives, basically they are followed until they die, or in a small number of cases they remarry and leave. So we have them every 3 years with some information about their their context and so forth until they exit. And there really aren't too many pre-20th century Chinese sources with this level of detail on adult women. It's fairly common if there are details on, say, wives in genealogies, they may not be much more than just the surname of the wife, typically without much information about when they married in or when they died, or etc. May just have information about who had sons. So the completeness of the records of adult women, that is, married or widowed women, are actually a distinct feature of the CMGPD-LN. Another limitation of the CMGPD-LN is that we don't have non-state occupations or landholding. So the sorts of occupations recorded in the registers are ones that reflect affiliation with the state bureaucracy, the eight-banner bureaucracy that administered this region, and with which these administrative populations were associated. So if people were doing other things, they had a yoga studio or an ice cream shop or something like that. Obviously they didn't. This is 18th to 19th century China. But if they were, say, business people or doing something that was not sort of interest to the state or related to the state, we just don't have that occupation. Now, that's probably not a major omission. This was an overwhelmingly agrarian population. It's unlikely that a lot of these people had non-agricultural sources of income. But related to that, we also, for this data set, we don't have landholding. We do have, in another data set, which I'll be talking about in another module, Shuangcheng CMGPD SC, we do have landholding, and we'll get to that later. And so, but when it comes to the CMGPD-LN, our main measure of direct measure of social status is for adult males that they have a title or position associated with the bureaucracy. The China multi-generational panel data set Liaoning has some other limitations that users should be aware of. One is that, as we alluded to before, some registers are missing. There are 29 administrative populations, and in principle, for each of these populations, a register should have been compiled every 3 years from 1749 to 1909. In practice, not all of those registers, if they were compiled, survive. That there are, for any one of the 29 administrative populations, some registers are missing. They're especially likely to be missing before 1789, and then 1807, as mentioned earlier, but then after that, there are other additional missing registers. What this implies is that it requires some restrictions or care when carrying out event history analysis. Specifically, much of the event history analysis relies on the recording of events in registers. For example, annotations that somebody had died within the last 3 years, the comparison between the previous register and the current register to infer that somebody had married in the last 3 years or that they'd had a child. So those are examples, but if an event, for example, a death or the outmarriage of a daughter, etc., took place or was recorded in a register that is missing, we don't have any record of it. And all we know is, or all we will see is that in comparing some preceding register, that is a surviving register that preceded the one that is missing, and a surviving register that follows the one that is missing, we simply may see that, for example, if it was somebody's death that had been recorded in the intervening register, that person would just simply disappear. That, for example, if 1807 was missing, someone was still alive in 1804, their death was recorded in the missing 1807 register, and then we have the 1810 register, that person would simply appear to disappear between 1804 and 1810. So, that's one issue. That affects all of the events that involve people being annotated, typically as in some form or another departing from the population. If that annotation was in a missing register, they just will seem to have disappeared. that can also affect women, that is, daughters and widows who marry out and are annotated as having done so. They are also, it also may affect people that leave the area without permission. So that's an issue that has to be dealt with, and in practice it is actually easy to deal with because we're dealing with discrete time event history. Simply, most of the time, if we're doing an event history analysis, we'll want to limit to the registers for which an immediately following register is also surviving, so that we only use the registers where the kind of register from 3 years later that would have records of annotations of events is also there, and we exclude registers from consideration when we're doing an analysis if the immediately succeeding register is also missing. Then in some very specific applications, this may have some other implications, but that's too much detail to go into here. Another issue that people that are interested in old age mortality should be aware of, and also certain other aspects of aging, is that it seems like there's a small number of unrecorded deaths, where it seems like there's a small percentage of people who almost certainly died, but whose death was not recorded, and then they were carried on as alive from register to register as if they were alive. So these are a very small percentage of the population. It doesn't really affect anything at younger ages because most of the population recorded in the registers is in fact alive, and these kind of people that are dead still being listed in the registers are only a small fraction of the population. However, once you get to advanced ages like 75 and above, when most of the people that were being properly recorded, or deaths who were being properly recorded, have all died off, increasingly the only people left in the registers are these basically people who died but whose deaths were not annotated and who are being carried forward indefinitely. So it's very common in our own mortality and other analyses to exclude people who appear to be age 75 and above, because most of those people are in fact probably already dead, and you can't really do much with them. When people or users are preparing to make use of the CMGPD-LN and the CMGPD-SC, there's a few things they should keep in mind. I alluded to this earlier, but I want to emphasize it, that because there are changes over time in the quality of the recording, the content, the details that are recorded, etc., anybody who's starting a new analysis with a variable that they're not already familiar with really should inspect descriptive statistics by year for those variables to look for irregularities that might suggest a need to limit the period for which analysis is conducted. So just some examples of situations where there's a change over time in recording. The records of disability deteriorated substantially in the early 19th century. So actually in the 18th century, you had very detailed disabilities recorded for adult males, including specific conditions. And then at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, increasingly, rather than recording a specific kind of condition or ailment, the disability annotation would simply be that this person's disabled. But then there was a sort of sudden increase in the numbers of men that were being listed as disabled, and then abruptly in the early 19th century, no more men were newly listed as disabled, and the sort of category gradually faded. So there's an example where if anyone studying disability should actually watch this look at this very carefully to figure out what registers they want to use. Another issue we've noticed is that birth date does not appear to be recorded reliably after the early 19th century. So in the 18th century and very early 19th century, people, at least men, have birth dates recorded. And when we've looked at tabulations to look at seasonality and so forth, the birth dates look like they're not immediately or obviously problematic. In in terms of the distributions, but things fall apart in the early 19th century, where starting in the early 19th century, you have sort of fairly clear indication of sort of clerical problems, where you have large numbers of people in succession with the same birthday or birth date, etc. So anyone interested in using birth date should, again, look at the descriptives by time. I mentioned earlier, the data do not distinguish residential houses before 1789. This was an administrative feature of the administrative system. Addresses are fairly rare before 1789. And then daughters are especially unlikely to be recorded after the 1830s. Users should also be aware that there was substantial institutional and geographic variation in the CMG China multi-generational panel dataset Liaoning. So I've mentioned before that there were 29 administrative populations. They had different institutional contexts. These are described in great detail in the user guide, and I strongly encourage everybody to read the material in the user guide. Broadly speaking, there were three types of populations, three types of administrative populations: regular banner populations, specialized populations that were responsible for specific types of production, minks, fish, etc. And then there were what we refer to as servile populations that had some hereditary status that limited their opportunities and constrained their behavior. Again, these are all described in considerable detail in the user guide, and it's especially it's important to read through the details on these populations because in some cases, especially with the what we refer to as the servile populations, their status, say, affected what sorts of opportunities that were available to them. So the people that were in the what we refer to as the servile populations were not eligible for a lot of official positions and titles. It's not clear whether one would want to include them in an analysis of stratification. Also, there's variation across the administrative populations in the quality of recording, especially certain kinds of details. There's also regional variation in the detail and completeness of recording. Generally, we see more daughters recorded in the northern populations than in the southern populations. And then, so the basic point is that we should always make sure to inspect the descriptive statistics for all the variables that people plan to include in the analysis, looking both at data set and region to look for patterns that need some explanation, may suggest some restrictions in terms of what is actually included in the analytic sample, and so forth. Here we have some figures that summarize some age patterns in the available observations and identify some of the characteristics that one wants to pay attention to. On top, you have age distribution for women. Obviously, it's quite apparent that daughters, unmarried women basically, are seriously underregistered. You see the numbers of registered women increase at around 17 or 18 because that's when women begin marrying, and then we begin to see women appearing as wives and eventually as widows in the data. So from age 22, 23, 24 on, by which time all women are married, you have a age distribution for women that looks pretty standard. And if you look at the overall age distribution of the population above age 20 or 30, it generally looks pretty reasonable. Now down below, you can see that we obviously have underregistration of boys, so relatively few boys being registered at very early ages. And then by age 6 or 7, things begin to look normal. Now, one of the you may notice that there's a sort of triennial pattern to the age distribution of males, where there's sort of a 3-year cycle in which there are especially large numbers of observations of boys aged 12, 15, 18, and so forth. This is not the result of rounding or anything. This is actually a real feature of the data, and it's picking up some periodicity in births. That there were some sort of seasonal, not seasonal, but there was some periodicity in terms of births, and there were sort of certain years, apparently, maybe a 3-year periodicity, at least in certain phases, where there's certain years where their births were more likely than others, and that gets picked up as a sort of signal that then gets attenuated over time as sort of mortality kind of wipes out the differences. Also, you do see what appear to be small numbers of men surviving to very advanced ages. Again, treat those observations with great suspicion. As a way of summarizing some of the time trends in births, here we present the sort of numbers of males and female births in the next 3 years for each of the register years. These are based on computed birth years, so that if somebody was, say, first recorded in, say, an 1801 register as 7 years old, or 7 sway, they would actually, that birth would actually be attributed to 1801, I guess 17, I have to think about this, 1795 or 1794. What we see here, a few basic patterns. One is that over time, the sort of numbers of girls that are daughters that are recorded declines very steadily. Sort of the big change is probably in the 1830s, but girls, if they are recorded, are most likely to be recorded in the sort of late 18th century. There's also a lot of year-to-year variation, which is actually probably real, that there was a lot of variation from one year to another in the numbers of births. This is, again, also, some of these ups and downs are also influenced by numbers of available registers, etc. For example, so the 1760, we have very few registers in the 1760s. That's why that looks especially low. Final point, yes, and you'll see very few daughters at all being born in the late 19th century. This figure summarizes some of the issues with related to the improbably elderly people that we see in our data set, people that are basically we think they died, but who are not recorded as dying and who were carried forward from one register to the next indefinitely. If you look at the solid heavy dashed line, the one for males all, so that's just straight raw probabilities of death in the next 3 years by age, and obviously that peaks at around age 80, and that part is probably real, but then after age 80, and this is very improbable, the probability of dying by age actually declines. And this, again, reflects the accumulation among the elderly of people that have actually already died and who are just being carried forward one register after another without their death being recorded. So essentially the recorded population above age 80 eventually becomes dominated by these immortals who are, again, almost certainly dead, but whose deaths were just not recorded. And some evidence of that is that if we make an adjustment where we compute death rates just for people who, or we basically exclude people who sort of survive to really improbable ages. We look at the lines for females 86 plus, males 86 plus. Those are computations in which anyone who survived to age 86 or higher is simply excluded. And then we see sort of death rates up into the early 80s that look actually reasonable. So so the implication is that the accumulation of these immortals really only begins to affect computed death rates overall, probably from the mid-70s onward, and that if you sort of throw out the immortals from a mortality calculation, looks like you get fairly reasonable estimates of death rates right up into the early 80s. But again, something to be careful about, and treat all the observations of people age 75 and above with great caution.